Abuse of slaves. Skin is not yours. Castration. Honey punishments. They woke up not to the light of the sun, but to the sound of whips. The first blows were not aimed at their backs, but at the air, so that everyone could hear. The slaves were made to understand that the day had begun, and that it no longer belonged to them. In the darkness of dawn, on the sugar and cotton plantations of the Caribbean and the American South, human bodies were merely part of a mechanism that produced raw materials for global empires. Their skin was not their own, their breath was not their own, even their pain did not belong to them. It was a tool, part of an economic calculation. In these lands there was no personal integrity, no right to say no. Everything was decided by the master and the market, where violence became not a side effect, but a fundamental business model. The diaries of 18th century European plantation managers contain cold entries. A man deprived of dignity and hope through castration, a woman punished in front of everyone for disobedience, lines written without emotion, like accounting notes. These practices were not flashes of cruelty, but a systematic tool of control. Castration was used to suppress male aggression, but also for sexual exploitation. Eunuchs became defenseless, deprived of the right to have children, but still forced to serve. The procedure itself was often carried out in unsanitary conditions, with rusty blades and without anesthesia. The mortality rate from infections was enormous, but this did not deter the owners. The loss of a couple of slaves was considered an acceptable price to pay for intimidating hundreds. One of the most terrifying methods of punishment mentioned in sources is the so-called honey punishment. In Europe, it was known as an exotic Eastern execution, but on tropical plantations, it took on a different meaning. A person was tied to a pole or tree, smeared with sticky syrup, and left in the sun. Insects, ants, wasps, flies, turned the body into a living wound. Sometimes the punished were kept like this for hours, sometimes for days, until the person died of shock or infection. The owner did not spend any bullets or resources on this. The violence was free and at the same time a public lesson for the rest. Sexual violence occupied a special place. It was not limited to hidden crimes. On the contrary, it became. The medical community of the time did not stand aside either. European doctors working in the colonies recorded cases of medical interventions, in quotation marks, because they were more often monstrous experiments. Slaves were castrated under the pretext of disease prevention. Women were prescribed sexual acts as a means of calming their nerves. The involvement of medicine in these practices gave them the appearance of legitimacy, although in reality they were legalized torture. In the cotton fields of America, everything was repeated with frightening accuracy. Slave owners relied on division and fear. Men were humiliated in public, women were broken through sexual subjugation, and children were taught to fear the whip from an early age. In the memoirs of one escaped slave from the South, he writes, "Women were raped in front of us, so that we knew we had no power to protect them." This was not a coincidence, but a systematic technique for destroying any solidarity. The deeper we look into the chronicles of the Holy Times, the clearer we understand that slavery was not just labor exploitation. It was a theater of pain, where power was built on demonstrative cruelty and the economy on the transformation of the human body into a commodity, expendable material, and a tool of intimidation. Violence was woven into every detail, from plantation accounting to the evening entertainment of white masters. And that is why the history of slavery remains not just a page in the past, but a document of how far civilization can go when human life is turned into a tool for profit. If you look at the records of colonial courts, the indifferent rhetoric is striking. Every slave's body was recorded as property, and all violence was considered not a crime, but damage to property. In Jamaica, in the mid-18th century, there are records of a case where a white manager raped a 13-year-old slave girl. The court ruled not to punish him, but only to compensate the girl's owner for her loss of ability to perform highly productive work. The victim herself is not mentioned in the records. Her voice did not matter. She was treated as a commodity that had been damaged before its time. In Barbados, during the same decades, public punishments became a spectacle for Europeans. Slaves convicted of the slightest offense, stealing a piece of sugar, trying to escape at night, uttering a word of protest, were brought to the central squares of the plantations. There, overseers demonstrated various practices of intimidation. One of these was burning the palms of the hands. The slave was forced to continue working, unable to hold a tool, and this was the point of the punishment, to show that even mutilation did not exempt one from labor. Another method was called lead water. Molten metal was dripped onto the skin, not killing the person immediately, but leaving them crippled and in constant pain. Such punishments served as a public lesson, so that the other slaves could see the price of disobedience. The testimonies of slaves that have come down to us in the form of records by abolitionists of the late 18th century record almost the same thing. The most terrible thing was not even the beatings, but the demonstrative violence against women. In his memoirs, Frederick Douglass, a former American slave, mentions a scene in which his master deliberately beat his aunt, a tall and strong woman, precisely because she could set an example to others. She was stripped naked, tied to a beam, and whipped until blood dripped onto the floor. For the others, it was a lesson. Resistance to the female body does not bring freedom. It only multiplies suffering. Evenings of fear were considered a special entertainment, when the masters staged improvised executions for their own pleasure. These could be staged interrogations in which the victim was forced to confess to imaginary sins. Sometimes slaves were forced to rape each other under threat of death. Some descriptions mention the practice of couples for the night. Male and female slaves were forcibly brought together so that their masters could have new slave children at no cost. These acts were accompanied by laughter and staged like performances. The role of the church was twofold. On the one hand, many missionaries did condemn violence, recorded unimaginable scenes in their reports, and tried to bring them to the attention of Europe. But at the same time, it was precisely the discourse of the church that often justified cruelty. Slaves were read the epistles of the Apostle Paul on the obedience of slaves to their masters, instilling in them the idea that suffering was the path to salvation. In the southern United States, priests could openly bless plantation owners, claiming that black people were born to serve white people. In this way, religion became a psychological weapon. Slaves not only submitted to physical pain, but also heard that it was God's will. The colonial administration viewed everything through the prism of profit. The Governors-General of the British West Indies wrote to London, "Slaves must be kept in fear and submission, for otherwise they will become useless." When rebellions did break out, As in Santo Domingo, at the end of the 18th century, the response was mass executions. People were burned alive, quartered, and thrown to dogs. These executions were described by eyewitnesses and were deliberately public. Dozens of slaves were killed in a single day to cool the blood of the rest. Violence was not only a form of punishment, but also a kind of language of power. Slaves understood that their bodies did not belong to them. They could be used, mutilated, destroyed at any moment. Women could be raped in front of their husbands and children. Men could be castrated or beaten to death without trial. A child could be sold to another colony, never to see his parents again. All these acts created an atmosphere of complete hopelessness, where any resistance seemed impossible. At the same time, the economic machine could not function without this system. Sugar plantations required monstrous labor, from dawn to dusk, without days off, at temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius. People worked with heavy knives, chopped cane, carried bundles, and squeezed juice. The death rate from heat stroke, exhaustion, and infected wounds was enormous. But instead of alleviating the conditions, the owners deliberately kept the slaves in a state of constant pain and fear. It was part of the calculation. If a slave knows that any slowdown will result in torture, he will work until his last breath. Thus, a world was created where violence became not just a tool, but a ritual, a norm, a daily reality. It was built into the economy, politics, religion, and social order. Sugar and cotton plantations did not just produce goods for Europe. They produced the very logic of horror, a demonstration that human beings could be reduced to the status of objects and that the abuse of the body could become the foundation of civilization. Doctors arriving in the colonies from Europe became part of the same machine. They not only treated slaves, but also observed them as living material. This is how the first forms of medical experiments emerged, cloaked in the rhetoric of science and progress. One of the most famous examples was the American surgeon James Marion Sims, later called the father of gynecology. In the mid-19th century, he performed operations on female slaves with severe injuries from violent childbirth. These women were forced to lie on the table without pain relief. According to Sims, black women are less sensitive to pain. Their bodies became laboratories where tissue was cut and stitched again and again until a suitable method was found. Although Sims was included in medical textbooks, his achievements were based on the suffering of those who had no right to say no. Similar experiments were conducted on sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Colonial doctors studied the effects of heat, infection, and exhaustion, recording data on how long a slave could work before fainting, how many lashes they could withstand before losing consciousness, and what herbs could be used to bring them back into service. These were not secret experiments. Reports were published in medical journals in London and Paris. There, slaves were regarded as natural objects, as if they were an intermediate link between animals and humans. At the same time, racial ideology was gaining ground. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European thinkers sought a scientific justification for slavery. Doctors of anthropology measured skulls, claiming that the angle of the forehead or the shape of the nose proved the innate submissiveness or intellectual inferiority of Africans. These measurements reinforced the right of white people to own other people's bodies. Philosophers and politicians cited scientific data to explain that slaves did not suffer in the same way as Europeans, and therefore mistreating them was not equivalent to mistreating full human beings. Doctors also perpetuated the myth of the hypersexuality of black people. Female slaves were declared lustful by nature, which served as a justification for mass rape. If a woman resisted, she was called a rebel and punished like a criminal. If she obeyed, it was said that she wanted it herself. In this way, the system of violence became a vicious circle, where every trauma was legalized through pseudoscience. A separate practice involved experiments on pregnant women. The owners and doctors wanted to know how many children women could bear without stopping their hard work in the fields. Women were forced to cut reeds until they gave birth, and miscarriages and deaths were recorded. Those who survived often gave birth to their children in huts without medical assistance and returned to work the next morning. This was profitable for the plantation owners. Every newborn slave was worth money, and if the mother died, the child was raised by other female slaves. Death in such conditions was perceived as statistics. Cold calculations can be found in the documents of English companies. Up to half of the slaves died during transport from Africa to the Caribbean, and the annual mortality rate on the plantations was about 30%. But the flow of new bodies was so constant that the owners did not even try to reduce the level of violence. On the contrary, they knew that fear and oppression worked better than care. 19th century racial theories cemented this order in the consciousness of Western society. Universities gave lectures on the inferiority of the black race, doctors wrote treatises on pain thresholds, and politicians referred to the natural order of things. As a result, bullying, castration, and violence became supposedly rational measures. The world learned to see suffering as a system rather than a crime. Truly horrific details have been preserved in the archives. In Louisiana, a doctor named Foster experimented with therapeutic violence, claiming that rape could cure women of melancholy. His records describe cases where female slaves were tied up and subjected to gang rape under supervision. The aim was to collect data on the effect of sexual intercourse on mental health. This was recorded dryly, without emotion, as a medical experiment. But behind these lines lay screams, blood, and ruined lives. Thus, slavery ceased to be merely a system of labor exploitation. It became a laboratory of violence, where medicine, economics, and politics worked together. Each body was turned into an object of study, control, and abuse. And it was here, in these fields and barracks, that an ideology was born that would later spill over into racial doctrines and become a justification for new wars and new genocides. Every act of resistance, even the smallest, was met with a wave of violence. Slave revolts broke out in all the colonies in Jamaica, Barbados, Santo Domingo, Virginia, and South Carolina. But every time the flame of hope for freedom was kindled, it was extinguished with whips, bonfires, and nooses. The most famous example was the uprising in Santo Domingo at the end of the 18th century, when hundreds of thousands of slaves rose up against French planters. That was when the Republic of Haiti was born, the first country where slaves managed to break the system. But this victory was preceded by years of horrific massacres, when French troops, together with local masters, slaughtered entire villages, burned fields, and destroyed families. On other islands, rebellions often ended in disaster. The rebellion in Jamaica in 1760 known as the Taco Bay Rebellion, was suppressed within a few weeks. Slaves were not simply killed, they were turned into lessons for the rest. Bodies were hung along roads, heads were impaled on stakes, and women were left naked on display as a symbol of complete submission. These public spectacles had a dual purpose: to intimidate the living and entertain the white population of the colony. In the American colonies, and later in the southern states of the United States, the logic was the same. After Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831, the authorities did not limit themselves to executing the leader and his comrades. Dozens of innocent slaves were put to the sword simply because they were suspected of sympathizing with the rebels. Women were raped before being hanged, and children were killed in front of their parents. These actions were documented in the reports of the governor of Virginia and were presented as necessary measures to protect order. The planters developed a whole system of punitive carnivals. After each rebellion, show trials were held. Slaves were gathered in squares, where overseers held improvised courts. The accused were beaten, tortured, castrated, and then killed in front of everyone. Sometimes their deaths turned into a real celebration for the whites. Music played, rum was poured, and guests from neighboring plantations were invited. Violence became a spectacle, a social glue that united the colonists in fear of the black threat. There were also more sophisticated forms of punishment designed to undermine the very idea of resistance. A slave could be forced to torture another slave, breaking bones, holding a whip, cutting with a knife. This broke solidarity and turned the community into a chain of mutual distrust. In some cases, children were forced to watch their parents being killed in order to instill the idea that your fate is sealed, resistance is pointless. It is noteworthy that the cruelty intensified after each rebellion. The owners knew that the more slaves there were, the greater the likelihood of a new uprising. Therefore, the system of intimidation became increasingly sophisticated. Slave codes appeared, laws prescribing exactly how to punish the disobedient. In South Carolina, a law was passed allowing any slave who raised a hand against a white person to be killed without trial. In Jamaica, it was decreed that rebels should be executed in such a way as to make a lasting impression. These formulations meant one thing: torture should not be hidden, but public, as humiliating and painful as possible. European powers also played their part. In London and Paris, it was understood that uprisings threatened the profits of the metropolises. Therefore, generals and officials developed instructions on how to suppress riots, how many soldiers to send, what types of executions were most effective, how to divide slaves along ethnic lines so that they would not unite. Violence became a strategy for governing empires. Slave rebellions were acts of desperate hope, but the system almost always responded with calculation and cold-bloodedness. Even when a rebellion failed, its consequences were another round of hell for the survivors. Slavery existed not only because of the power of weapons, but also because of the constant demonstration that any attempt at resistance would be drowned in blood, torture, and humiliation. In the fields where sugar and cotton ripened, a special culture of violence was born, a culture of public executions, punitive holidays, and collective terror. It became ingrained in the blood of generations and fixed in their memory, leaving a mark that would echo for centuries to come. The abolition of slavery in the 19th century did not mean the end of suffering. The laws changed, but habits and power structures remained the same. In the American South, after emancipation, former slaves found themselves in a situation that historians call freedom without freedom. Formally, they no longer belonged to a master, but economically and socially they remained dependent. They were again forced to work on plantations, now through a system of debt bondage, where a person signed a contract but could never pay it off. Physical violence did not disappear. The whip was replaced by the terror of the white brotherhoods, groups later known as the Ku Klux Klan. They used the same methods as the planters had used centuries earlier: kidnapping, beating, maiming, and rape. Women were targeted for punitive visits. Rape continued to be a means of intimidation and subjugation. Men were lynched, hung from trees, burned alive, castrated. These executions once again became a spectacle. Crowds gathered, food was sold, photographs were taken. The death of a former slave became a postcard that could be sent to acquaintances. The situation developed similarly in the Caribbean and Brazil. Although slavery was formally abolished, the white elite retained control. Sexual violence continued to serve as a means of domination. Local laws almost never protected black women. If they were raped by a white man, the courts either acquitted him or did not even consider the case. Memoirs from the late 19th century contain stories of women whom their owners would not let go, even when they were formally free. They were forced to work and sleep with their former overseers under threat of starvation or expulsion. Medicine also embraced the logic of experimentation. In the United States in the early 20th century, the so-called Tuskegee syphilis experiments were conducted, in which hundreds of black men were deliberately denied treatment so that doctors could observe the progression of the disease. This project lasted for decades and was directly based on the same tradition. The body of an African American was considered a convenient object for science, not deserving of consent or care. 19th century racial theories gradually transformed into segregation laws. Now the violence took a more covert form, but the essence remained the same: to deprive the body of freedom, to force people to live in fear, to instill a sense of inferiority. Stereotypes created during the era of slavery became entrenched in culture: lustful black women and dangerous black men. These stereotypes served as justification for new rapes and new lynchings. But the memory of the slave plantations did not disappear. It lived on in songs, in oral histories, in whispered stories about how women died at the hands of overseers, how children were sold at market, how men were castrated in front of crowds. This memory became a shadow that no official reform could erase. And if at the beginning of the story whips cracked in the cane fields, centuries later they echoed in a different form: in police violence, discrimination, sexualized stereotypes, and systemic poverty. Slavery did not end with the signing of the decree. It spilled over into social and cultural structures, continuing to exist as the invisible foundation of a world built on the perverse idea that some bodies belong to others. Thus, a centuries-long cycle was formed in which skin remained not one's own. From tropical plantations to industrial cities, from the fires of rebellion to courtrooms, from castrations and honey executions to medical experiments and lynchings. And the history of abuse was no accident. It was a system taken to its extreme, where the human body became an arena of power, and pain became a universal currency. And even when slavery was officially abolished, the shadow of this system continued to shape the future.